I found the letter by accident. It had slipped behind the old wooden dresser in the guest room, the one my late husband Gerald had built with his own hands the summer before his diagnosis. I was finally cleaning out that room 3 years after he'd passed, 3 years of telling myself I'd get to it eventually when I moved the dresser, and there it was. A sealed envelope, addressed to someone named Wallace Drummond, care of a law firm in Vancouver. The return address said First Nations Veterans Trust Fund. The postmark was 8 months old. My hands went still. Wallace had been working for me for 2.5 years. He slept in the small room above my garage, the one my son had used as a teenager. He ate breakfast at my kitchen table every morning, porridge with maple syrup, the same thing every day without fail. I paid him $200 a week, cash, which he accepted with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything. And now there was a letter from a legal trust fund sitting behind a dresser in my guest room, with his name on it. I stood there in the cold hallway for a long moment, listening to the sound of him splitting firewood out back, that steady rhythm I had come to rely on more than I wanted to admit. I set the letter on the kitchen counter and went to put the kettle on. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. My name is Dorothy Sinclair. I am 64 years old. I live in a small town called Merrickville, about an hour south of Ottawa in Ontario. I have run a bed and breakfast out of my Victorian farmhouse for 22 years. My husband Gerald helped me build it from nothing. We converted the old property ourselves, room by room, saving every penny, doing most of the labor on weekends. We raised 2 children here, our son Thomas and our daughter Claire, both of them long gone to cities by the time Gerald got sick. When Gerald died, I kept the B&B running because I didn't know what else to do with myself. The house was too big, too quiet, too full of him. Running it gave me a reason to get up every morning, a reason to make the beds properly and bake the scones and pretend the world was still functioning the way it was supposed to. But I was struggling. I won't pretend otherwise. I had one part-time helper, a young woman named Kayla who came in on weekends to help with cleaning and breakfast service. The property itself was starting to wear. The back fence needed replacing. The garden, which had always been Gerald's domain, was becoming overgrown. I had 3 guest rooms, but I could only manage 2 at a time by myself during the week. Revenue was dropping. I was $59,000 into a line of credit I'd taken out the winter after Gerald died. When the furnace failed and the roof needed patching and my accountant sat across from me with a face like a man delivering a terminal prognosis, that was the situation the morning I met Wallace. It was early November, a Saturday, the kind of raw gray morning that settles into your bones. I had driven into town to pick up supplies from the hardware store and a few things from the farmer's market before it closed for the season. I was loading bags into the back of my SUV when I noticed him. A man sitting on the bench outside the post office, wearing a worn canvas jacket that was nowhere near adequate for the weather. He had a duffel bag at his feet and a thermos he was nursing with both hands. His hair was gray and close-cropped. His face had that particular stillness. I recognized the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion so deep it has run out of places to go. He looked to be in his mid-60s. Indigenous, I thought, though I wouldn't have presumed to say from where. I almost kept walking. I had my own problems. I had scones that needed to be baked before my 2 guests came down for breakfast. I had a gutter that had been pulling away from the roofline for a week and a half, and I hadn't figured out what to do about it. Instead, I walked over to him. "Cold morning to be sitting outside," I said. He looked up. His eyes were dark and very calm. "Cold morning to be making conversation with strangers," he replied, without any meanness in it. I laughed despite myself. "Dorothy Sinclair," I said, and offered my hand. He shook it. Firm, brief, deliberate. Wallace Drummond. I don't know exactly what made me do what I did next. Maybe it was Gerald. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been sitting in my chest like river ice for 3 years. Maybe it was simply that the man had kind eyes and a thermos that had clearly been refilled too many times at a gas station. "I run a bed and breakfast about 15 minutes from here," I said. "I need someone who can do maintenance, garden work, general upkeep, room and board, and $200 a week cash. I can't afford more than that right now, but the room is warm and the food is decent." He looked at me for a long moment. Not the way someone looks when they're calculating an opportunity. The way someone looks when they're deciding whether to trust something they've stopped believing in. "I'm not looking for charity," he said. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering work. The distinction matters to me. Another long pause. Then, all right. That's how it started. My daughter Claire called the following Thursday. She'd heard from Thomas, who had heard from me in a passing remark during our weekly phone call, that I had hired a stranger I met outside the post office and let him move into the room above the garage. Mum. Her voice had that particular tone she had developed somewhere in her late 20s, equal parts love and exasperation. What are you doing? Running my property, I said. You don't know anything about this man. You didn't check references. You didn't do a background check. You just invited a stranger to live on your property. He's working, Claire. He replaced the back fence in 4 days. He fixed the gutter. He's been raking the garden every morning without being asked. That's not the point, Mum. The point is you're alone out there, and you're 61 years old, and since Dad died, you've been… What? Say it. A pause. Different. You've been making decisions you wouldn't have made before. I thought about that for a moment. Maybe the decisions I was making before weren't the right ones, I said. Maybe different isn't the same as wrong. She didn't have an answer for that. But she drove up from Toronto the following weekend, and I watched her watching Wallace from the kitchen window as he rebuilt the retaining wall along the lower garden path. She didn't say anything negative when she left. She hugged me longer than usual at the door. That was enough. Wallace was not a man who spoke much about himself. I learned this early and respected it, the way you respect any landscape that doesn't immediately give up its geography. He was thorough, careful, and quietly skilled in ways that kept surprising me. He repaired the sagging veranda boards so cleanly you couldn't tell where the old wood ended and the new began. He winterized the garden properly, something I hadn't managed since Gerald died. He was unfailingly courteous to my guests, carrying luggage, holding doors, recommending local walks with the confidence of someone who had studied the land. He never talked about his past. When guests asked him how long he'd been in Merrickville, he said, "A little while." When I asked him over dinner one evening where he was from originally, he said, "North of here," and turned the conversation to whether I wanted him to repaint the garden shed in the spring. I let it go. I had my own silences. I understood the value of them. What I noticed, in the way you notice things when you are paying attention without meaning to, was that Wallace read constantly. He had a stack of library books that cycled every 2 weeks history, mostly, and what I would call policy literature, government documents and reports that he'd requested through interlibrary loan, the kind of reading that takes serious concentration. He also wrote in a battered spiral notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, filling pages in a small, neat hand I sometimes glimpsed when he set it down to help me carry something. I asked him about it once. "Thinking things through," he said, and closed the notebook. The second year, things got harder for me financially. A leak in the plumbing behind the kitchen wall turned into a $4,000 repair. I lost a booking I'd been counting on when a larger property opened up nearby with newer facilities. My accountant, Janet, the same woman who had delivered the original bad news, sat across from me again in February with a spreadsheet I didn't want to look at. "Dorothy," she said carefully, "you need to think seriously about whether this property is viable long-term." I stared at the numbers. "I'm not selling." "I'm not telling you to sell. I'm telling you the math needs to change. You need more revenue, or you need less overhead, or both." I drove home in the kind of silence that is not quiet at all. Wallace was on the porch when I pulled into the driveway. He took one look at my face and said nothing, just held the door open and went to put the kettle on, which is exactly what Gerald would have done. We sat at the kitchen table. I told him some of it, not all, enough. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What would help the most right now?" "Practically. The mortgage payment I'm behind on," I said before I could stop myself. 2 months. I've been managing the line of credit, but I let the mortgage fall behind. It's $11,000. I hadn't meant to say that. I felt my face go hot. "Give me a week," he said. "Wallace, I'm not asking you for…" "I know. Give me a week." He was gone for 4 days. He told me he had something to take care of, that he'd be back Friday. I didn't sleep well. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was fine on my own, that I had always been fine on my own, and none of those things were entirely true. He came back on Thursday evening, a day early. He set an envelope on the kitchen table while I was washing up after dinner. Inside was a bank draft made out to me for $15,000, drawn on a TD bank account in Vancouver. I sat down. Wallace. "It's mine," he said simply. "I have money. I've always had money. This is not a sacrifice. Please use it." Where does a man who was sitting on a bench outside a post office with a gas station thermos have money? He almost smiled. "That's a fair question, and you deserve an answer. But not tonight. Tonight you should just let it help." I held the bank draft for a long time, then I set it on the table. "Tell me tomorrow," I said, "and I'll use it." He nodded. Then he got up and went to wash his own dishes, the way he always did. That night, after the house was quiet, I did something I am not proud of. I went up to the room above the garage. He'd left the door unlocked. He always left it unlocked. Said he had nothing worth stealing, and I looked around. Not through his things, exactly. I want to be honest about this. I didn't open drawers. But there was the duffel bag on the chair, slightly open, and the edge of something official-looking was visible. A manila envelope. I told myself I wouldn't touch it. Then I picked it up. The envelope had a logo on it, a stylized eagle in dark blue, and the words Drummond and Associates, Policy Consultants, Ottawa, Vancouver. Inside was a letter, not the one I'd found behind the dresser, but another one, a formal document from the Assembly of First Nations, with a letterhead I recognized from the news. It referred to Wallace by his full name, Wallace James Drummond, and in the body of the letter, referred to his foundational contributions to the 2015 and 2019 policy frameworks and his continued advisory role. I set it back. I went downstairs. I sat in Gerald's armchair in the dark for a very long time. In the morning I made porridge. We sat across from each other at the table. I waited until he'd had half his coffee. "Wallace James Drummond," I said. "Policy Consultant, Assembly of First Nations." His hands were very still around his mug. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since last night." "I'm sorry. I went up and I saw I shouldn't have." "No," he said, "you shouldn't have. But I understand why you did." A pause. Then, "Tell me the rest, please." He set down his coffee. He looked out the window at the garden, at the frost still on the ground. "I was a policy lawyer," he said. "First Nations advocacy, primarily around land rights and veterans' benefits. I built a consulting firm out of it over about 20 years. At our peak, we had 42 staff, offices in Ottawa and Vancouver, and we had shaped 3 pieces of federal legislation. He said this without pride, just as fact. I also had a partner of 23 years, a man named Edward Chartrand, and a daughter, Melissa, from a relationship early in my life. She was 31. I noticed he was speaking in past tense. 4 years ago, Edward was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's. We had 18 months, roughly, before it progressed significantly. We used that time as well as we could. He died 2 years ago, April. He paused. 3 weeks after Edward's funeral, Melissa was in a car accident outside of Sudbury. She was driving home from visiting me. She died before the ambulance arrived. The kitchen was absolutely silent. "Wallace," I said. "I didn't." He stopped. Started again. "I kept working for 6 months after Melissa died. I don't know why. Momentum, maybe? Or the fear of what would happen if I stopped. And then one day I was sitting in a meeting in our Ottawa office, listening to someone present slides about consultation timelines, and I looked around the table at all these people I had worked alongside for years, and I felt absolutely nothing. No connection, no purpose. Nothing. He turned his coffee mug slowly in his hands. I left the meeting. I told my business partner, a woman named Sandra, that I needed time. I signed over operational control to her and I just left. I took my personal vehicle, and I drove east, then south. I ended up in Merrickville because the car needed an oil change, and I liked the look of the river. He looked at me then. The money was never a problem. The firm is worth considerably more than I need. I have personal investments that I've never touched. The trust fund letter you found, that's a disbursement I'm owed from a veterans settlement I helped negotiate years ago. Ironic given that I've been behaving like a man with nothing. A pause. I didn't want the money to be the point. I needed to find out if I was still a person without it. Without the title, without the office, without Edward and Melissa, without any of it. I thought about Gerald. About the first winter without him, when I had wandered through this house for days at a time without speaking to another human being. About how small and strange I had felt inside my own life. "Did you find out?" I asked. Something shifted in his face. "I think you helped me find out," he said. "You treated me like a man who was useful, not like a grieving widower, not like a distinguished consultant on medical leave. Just like someone whose labor had value. Do you understand how much that meant?" I thought about Kayla, my part-time helper, the way she'd started introducing Wallace to guests as the one who actually keeps this place running. I thought about the guests themselves, a couple from Kingston who'd sent me a card at Christmas saying the man who'd recommended the Rideau Trail had made their whole trip. "I understand more than you think," I said. The silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that means something has been laid down and doesn't need to be picked up again. "The 15,000, I said finally, "is nothing. Sandra sent me a dividend summary last month. The firm had its best year since 2019. I could write you a check for 10 times that amount and not notice it in any practical sense. That is not me being dramatic. That is just the truth. I'm not asking for 10 times that amount. I know, but I want to help, not out of guilt. Not because I pity what you're carrying, because this place," he gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the window, the garden beyond, "this place gave me back something I thought was gone. And you did that. So letting me help keep it solvent seems proportionate. I used the bank draft. I paid the mortgage arrears and the remaining credit balance. I had enough left to replace the heating system in the east guest room that had been unreliable since October. 2 weeks later, I told my daughter Claire the whole story, every bit of it. There was a long silence on the phone. "Mum," she said finally, "don't say it." I was going to say, another pause. I was going to say that I'm glad. I'm glad you stopped at that bench. I hadn't expected that. My eyes went suddenly full. "You're not angry? You think I was reckless?" "I think you've always known things about people that the rest of us miss," she said. "Dad used to say that. He said you had a way of seeing who someone was underneath what they were showing." I hadn't known Gerald had said that. I held the phone for a moment without speaking. "How is he really?" Claire asked. "Wallace?" "Healing," I said. "Slowly. The way you do." She understood. She had watched me do it. Over the following months, things shifted at the B&B in ways I hadn't anticipated. Wallace, no longer keeping his background entirely to himself, began contributing in different ways. He knew people, lawyers, nonprofit directors, heritage board members, and quietly made introductions. A heritage designation application I had been attempting to navigate alone for 2 years suddenly had a proper legal framing. A grant for rural tourism operators that I hadn't known existed appeared in my inbox, forwarded by someone Wallace had known from his Ottawa years. He didn't take over. That matters. He stayed at the periphery, in the background, and continued to split firewood and reseed the south garden and help with breakfast service on busy weekends. The work, the physical daily work, clearly still mattered to him. I understood that too. There is a kind of grief that needs your hands busy. It is its own form of prayer. One evening in late September, we were sitting on the veranda after a long day. The Rideau River was just visible through the trees at the far end of the property, going copper and gold with the sunset. I had poured 2 glasses of cider from a local orchard. He didn't drink alcohol, and neither did I anymore, not since the first year after Gerald. "Sandra called this week," he said. "Your business partner?" "Yes. She's been approached about a government contract. A large one, related to the new Indigenous consultation framework. She wants my involvement. At least in an advisory capacity." "What did you tell her?" "That I'd think about it." He was quiet for a moment. "I've also been contacted by a woman I used to work with who's now at the Institute for Research on Public Policy. She's writing about the gaps in veterans' settlement follow-through. She wants to collaborate." I looked at him sideways. And I think I might be ready to do something with my brain again. Not full-time, not the way it was before, but something. He turned his glass in his hands. "Edward always said that the worst thing I could do would be to waste the capacity I had. He said it was almost a moral obligation. I used to find that irritating, to be honest. Something close to a smile. I find it less irritating now." "He sounds like he was insufferable in the best possible way," I said. Wallace laughed. It was the first real laugh I had heard from him, full and genuine, and it surprised us both. He was absolutely insufferable, he said. I miss him every single day. We sat with that for a while, the way you can sit with loss when it has stopped being an emergency and become simply part of the landscape. There's something else, he said eventually. I waited. Melissa had a son. My grandson. He's 7. His name is Jacob. His father raised him, a good man, and after the accident, I couldn't. I wasn't capable of being present for anyone. I told myself Jacob was better off without a grandfather who was falling apart. I recognize this. The way grief makes us believe our absence is a kindness when it is really just our own inability to bear witness. You've been in contact? I asked. His father reached out last month. He said Jacob asks about me. That Jacob's teacher assigned a project about family, and Jacob wanted to draw his grandfather, and his father didn't know how to explain why that grandfather wasn't in the picture. I felt that one in my chest. Wallace. I know. He drew you anyway, didn't he? A long pause. He drew a man in a canvas jacket, he said quietly, fixing something with his hands. I had to look away toward the river for a moment. You need to go, I said when I trusted my voice again. I know I do. I've written to his father. I'm flying to Edmonton in 2 weeks. He paused. I'm scared. Of course you are. Go anyway. He was gone for 11 days. The B&B was fully booked that week, October being leaf-peeping season along the Rideau, and I managed fine. More than fine. I realized, somewhere around day 4, that managing fine was no longer something I needed to prove to myself or to Claire or to anyone. I simply did it because it was my work and my home and my life, and I had rebuilt those things through 2 years of grief, and I was not going to let them slip. Wallace came back on a Sunday evening. He set his bag down in the kitchen doorway, and I looked at his face, and I knew immediately. Well, I said. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photograph. A small boy with Wallace's dark eyes and a gap-toothed grin, standing beside Wallace in what looked like a park, both of them holding what appeared to be very large ice cream cones in the middle of October. He's 7, Wallace said, and he already argues like a litigator. Wants to know the reason behind every single thing. I can't imagine where he gets that from. Wallace put his phone away. He stood in my kitchen, in his canvas jacket and his worn boots, this man who had built a career on shaping federal policy, and who had spent 2.5 years splitting my firewood and eating porridge at my table, and there was something different in him. A settledness that had not been there before. I'm going to Edmonton for Christmas, he said. Jacob wants to show me his school. That's good, Wallace. And I'm going to take Sandra's advisory role, part-time, something to use the parts of me that have been sitting idle. Also good. He looked around the kitchen. I'd like to stay on here, if that still works. You reorganized my linen closet while I wasn't looking, I said. You painted the garden shed. You made friends with every single guest who has walked through that door in 2 years. Of course it still works. He nodded, the way he always nodded, brief and deliberate. Dorothy, he said, I need to say something. Then say it. When I sat down on that bench in November 2.5 years ago, I was not a man who believed that anything of value was going to happen to him again. I had stopped believing in the possibility of it. He paused, choosing his words the way he always did, carefully, without rushing. And then a woman I had never met offered me work, and meant it, and it turned out to be the thing I needed most in the world, not the money, not the resources. The being needed, the having somewhere to be. I thought about Gerald, about the last conversation we'd had about the B&B the week before his diagnosis when he'd said, You know what this place is really for, don't you, Dot? It's not the tourism dollars. It's the fact that people arrive tired and leave a little less so. You gave me the same thing back, I said. That's how this works. You gave me a reason to keep the lights on. He didn't say anything else. He went to wash his hands and start on dinner, because it was his turn, and he kept track. I sat at the kitchen table with my cider and listened to the sounds of the house, the old pipes settling, the October wind against the east windows, the quiet, competent movements of a man who had become, without either of us having planned for it, something very like family, Claire brings her children up from Toronto at March break every year now. My grandson, who is 8, has decided that Wallace is his honorary great-uncle, a title Wallace accepted with the gravity of someone being sworn into office. Thomas drove in from Vancouver last August, and the three of us spent an entire Saturday canoeing the Rideau, which Wallace had apparently done many times, and we had apparently been doing completely wrong. The B&B is not a gold mine. It was never going to be a gold mine. But it is solvent, and it is full of people on weekends, and the heritage designation came through in the spring, which means it will still be standing for whoever comes after me. And sometimes in the evenings when the guests have gone up and the kitchen is clean, Wallace and I sit on the veranda with our glasses of cider and watch the river go dark, and we talk about Edward and Gerald and Melissa and all the people we carry, and about what it means to rebuild a life when you didn't expect to have to, and about Jacob's latest arguments in the car on the way to school, and whether Claire is finally going to stop worrying about me, which she isn't, which is fine. I am 64 years old. I run a heritage bed and breakfast on the Rideau River. I made a strange and impulsive decision on a cold November morning, and it turned out to be the truest thing I have done since Gerald died. I didn't save Wallace Drummond. I offered him work, and he showed up for it, and it turned out that showing up was what we both needed more than anything else. He didn't save me either. We just gave each other a reason to stay in the fight a little longer, which is, I think, the most any of us can honestly offer. And it is more than enough.